Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is a headphone. That's right, this is the Sendy Aiva. So this is a headphone that actually came out, from what I can tell, a couple of years ago. And it's already gone through a bit of a cycle of initial hype, but then also some controversy afterward. And that controversy seems to be stemmed around the fact that some super sleuths on the internet figured out that the driver that's in the Sendy Aiva is actually used in a handful of other headphones from manufacturers like I think Blonde, Sivga, maybe Monoprice. And that seems to bother some people. And I'll just say up front, I needed to mention that and get that out of the way, but this review is not really going to talk too much about that controversy for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, I don't have those other headphones here to compare. But reason number two is that the controversy seems a little bit silly to me, just based on my perspective and my experience with chi-fi in general. My experience in the earphone world, right? I'm reviewing different earphones every week, and it's very, very common that those earphones will actually employ the same drivers, especially when it comes to balanced armatures. There really aren't that many different driver OEMs out there, but in the earphone world, at least, I'm very used to the fact that the same driver in one earphone can sound completely different from the same driver in a different earphone, or even if the sound happened to be exactly the same, which is never really the case. But even if the sound happened to be exactly the same, there's a lot more to an earphone or a headphone than just the driver. There's how does it look? How does it feel? Is it comfortable? Is it made out of nice materials? And all that kind of stuff. Those are different things between this headphone and those other headphones that use the same driver. So I would love one day to be able to hear those headphones and compare them, but for now, we're just going to talk about the Sendy Aiva and how this compares to the headphones that I do have access to, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, for now, let's just a couple of bits about the Aiva worth talking about. I may have mentioned this already. I might have forgotten. It is a planar magnetic driver earphone or headphone. I gotta get used to saying headphone, right? And that's just a different way of producing sound. We're not going to go over the technology here. If you want to learn about planar magnetics, look it up on YouTube, join the Discord server or something like that. We can talk about it. But it is a distinct aspect of this headphone, and it's going to play into the sound, which we'll talk about. The other thing worth talking about right now up front is that this is not a cheap headphone. It's about $600, although it seems like it's normally priced around $550 now, or on drop a little bit under $500. So it's come down in price a little bit, but I'm going to treat this as roughly a $600 headphone. And I guess that's about as much as we can tell you about this thing right now. So I'll just say, like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. And if you're watching now live, if you have any questions about the Sendy Aiva or any of the other headphones that we talk about today, leave them in the live chat at the end of the review. We'll hang out, have a little back and forth conversation. But for now, let's just dive into the Aiva. Like I typically do, talk about what comes inside the box. And you'll probably notice I've got a big speaker here. Just this does not come in the box. You don't normally see that, but I have zoomed out for the scale of headphones. But anyway, what we've got inside the box. Actually, I mean, it's relatively basic, but pretty nice if I'm perfectly honest. So we'll put the headphone aside for a second and take a look at this case. This is actually a really nice hard case. I wish more headphones came with a case like this, for two reasons. One, it's nice to be able to store your headphone in a nice hard protective case, and it actually stands up vertically, which makes it really easy to store. Thank you for those little feet down there. The other thing is just the size of it is kind of just about perfect. Like, it fits the headphone kind of like a glove and doesn't take up a bunch of wasted space. So for those reasons, I'm actually pretty happy with this little case. Not too shabby an inclusion. Of course, you get a cable, because this is a wired headphone. This is not a Bluetooth set, if in case you were curious. And the cable here, let's do a little bit of a zoom in on this. This is, you know, it's got, I believe these are 2.5 millimeter connectors up here, dual, that go into either side of the headphone. That you could find replacements, and it's a fairly standard connector, although it seems like more of the cables that, as I was looking around at what's available in the market, more of them are available in 3.5 millimeter terminations. So these 2.5 millimeters might be a little bit more difficult to find, although it seems like the Sennheiser HD700 used roughly the same layout. So if you're looking for replacement cables, maybe HD700 cables will do the trick. The other thing worth calling out here about the terminations is that by stock, by default, this thing comes with a 4.4 millimeter balanced termination. Now, if you don't have a 4.4 millimeter balance connector on whatever your sources are, that's okay. They do also include this little pigtail dongle, which takes your 4.4 millimeter and turns it into a standard 3.5 millimeter, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's interesting because I feel like most headphones come with kind of a default 1/4 inch or 6.3 millimeter connector. And here there's no option for that. To use this on a typical headphone amplifier, you would ostensibly have to either run this thing balanced and you hope that you have a 4.4 millimeter, or for the headphone amplifiers that I have, you have to run it 3.5 and then 3.5 to 6.3 millimeter adapter, etc., etc. Anyway, it's worth calling out up front. I don't really care too much about using 3.5 versus 6.3 or using adapters there. What is a little bit annoying for me is this whole pigtail system in general. I do have some digital audio players, some DAPs that use 4.4, and I was able to actually use this for the most part just using the 4.4 millimeter connector, which is nice. But I'm honestly just not that big of a balanced guy. I haven't quite drank the Kool-Aid on that one. So for me, I generally prefer the compatibility of 3.5, and having to have this on a dongle or having this little pigtail thing on there constantly, it's a little bit of a hassle, but I don't know, as far as these things go, it's not the worst. The cable itself, you can tell, is this kind of, it looks a lot like an IEM cable, right? It's kind of this braided style, looks like a copper cable. I don't know what the actual makeup is, but for the most part, a pretty decent cable. You can see behavior-wise, it's pretty solid. It's got a decent amount of thickness to it, but not overly thick, not overly stiff. Generally pretty well behaved. The Y split is a little bit curious. We'll get into talking about the aesthetic stuff in a little bit. But the Y split is actually made out of wood, which is, I think, interesting. And it does have a chin cinch, which you don't actually see on a lot of headphones. Pretty common with IEMs, not super common with headphones. But then, yeah, it does split into two different pieces that go into the ear cup. And let me go ahead and roadie wrap this thing back together just so our table's a little bit not tidier. But yeah, otherwise, I don't think there's too much more to talk about the cable. So that will lead us into talking about the headphone itself. Ta-da! So, I'll just say, let's see. Up front, I think that this thing is in person nicer looking and better built than I expected it to be, honestly, based on the pictures. I think what in the pictures I was a little bit concerned about is this grill material. To me, I assumed it was going to be a plastic, and it felt like something that looked a little bit cheap. But here in person, in the flesh, this grill actually appears to be metal. In fact, I think all of the touch points on this headphone are either going to be metal. You got actual wood. This is zebra wood. You've got, I believe, a real leather band. You've got this steel band up here. There's basically no plastic touch points at all, which frankly is kind of nice. And I guess that's what you might expect for a $600 headphone. This is definitely not a cheap set. But I don't know. Yeah, worth calling out that in pictures, I thought this thing looked pretty neat, but maybe not like the sturdiest, but in the hand, in practicality, wearing it and stuff like that, I'm actually pretty impressed with the build quality. The aesthetic of it, I don't know. I'm a little bit mixed on the aesthetic, and I think part of it is that it's just kind of a bit of a mishmash of different aesthetics, I find. I think the wood ear cups and some of these like wood cable bits, and even this like scale pattern kind of give it a bit of an old school, just a bit of an old look, a little bit of an antique-y look. But then you get parts like this headband, especially here at the yoke where it's angled, and then the Sendy Aiva, the Sendy Audio logo. It just looks a little bit modern, and so because of that kind of mishmash of the modern with the classic look, I don't know, it feels a little incoherent visually. But in terms of build quality and how well I think this thing's going to hold up, it is actually pretty impressive. If I were being picky about this, hey, Sendy, if you want some feedback from a guy who does not design headphones, honestly, I think just getting rid of the Sendy Audio logo or changing the font or doing something will go a long way and just streamlining the look. But I probably would also get rid of the wood accents on the cable, because that just feels a little bit too much for me. On the topic of build quality, This is a pretty minor complaint, but this headband, you know, it does seem that it is made out of an actual leather. At least Sendy claims, or they go out of the way to talk about this being a real leather. And it does feel like a nice material, but you might notice it's a little bit actually kind of floppy, a little bit too soft. And I do generally like this sort of suspension system when it comes to comfort. And we're about to talk about comfort in a second. But you know, just aesthetically, I wish that it wasn't flopping its way down all the time. Feels a little bit stiffer, and this is just being really pedantic and picky, but those are the sorts of things that you think about when you got this thing sitting on your couch for a couple of weeks. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about comfort on the Aiva. And for the most part, I think this is actually a really comfortable headphone. So you can see it sits circumaural, which means it sits over the ears entirely. They are fairly large ear cups that, I don't know, when I'm wearing them, I don't feel really any part of the ear cup touching my ears. There's plenty of room in there. My ears are not anywhere close to, let's zoom in here on the table. My ears are nowhere close to touching the driver. Down here, you know, you've got a sufficient amount of depth. And then the clamp on the Aiva is pretty polite. Like out of the box, this is a really comfortable headphone. It fits nice and secure, nice and comfortable. Pretty solid there. The other thing worth calling out here while we're looking at the pads is you see this interesting shape to them, right? They're a little bit thin up top, a little bit thinner in the front, but then get quite a bit thicker back here in the back. And the reason for that is that when you wear this thing on your headphone, that part like contours the back of your skull, or at least for most people, and yeah, just creates a nice seal. Which, and also I guess evenly distributes the pressure, right? A lot of times some people will have issues with a headphone with a more traditional flat pad creating pressure points in like the jaw where maybe it sticks out a little bit. But this, I actually generally found this thing very comfortable and happy to wear this thing all day. Anything else worth talking about it? I mean, I guess we'll talk about the weight of this. This is about a 420 gram headphone, which is not super lightweight. You know, the Apple AirPods Max. And I'm just going to bring up the AirPods Max because that was a headphone that recently had some controversy about how heavy it was. The AirPods Max is a 385 gram headphone. This is 420 grams, so even heavier than the AirPods Max. But my honest opinion, this does not feel heavy on my head, and frankly, neither did the AirPods Max. I think the AirPods Max felt heavy kind of only in the context of comparing them to something like the Sony WFs, which are fairly lightweight. So generally pretty happy with the weight, generally happy with the comfort, generally pretty happy with the build. It's just kind of the aesthetic of it that I wish was a little bit more uniform and a little bit more coherent. So I think that about does it for the physical aspects of the Sendy Aiva. So how's this thing sound? And for reference, what I've kind of my neutral reference when it comes to headphones. I know I review IMs all the time, but I do have a decent collection of headphones, and my go-to for daily use is the Sennheiser HD600. Kind of a boring choice, I know. That's a pretty common choice, but I really like that headphone. The HD600 is, I would say, my neutral reference. So how does this thing stack up? Well, we'll leave the direct comparisons to the HD600 for a little bit, but the general sound signature, the tonality here on the Aiva is, let's see. I know the word neutral gets abused, and I'm one of those people that will abuse the word neutral, but this is roughly a neutral headphone. This is not a V-shaped sounding headphone. This is not a bass-centered headphone. This is a relatively clean, just kind of mid-range focus with actually a little bit of bright upper treble emphasis, which we'll talk a little bit more about as well. The mid-range here, relatively neutral, although there's maybe a little bit of coloration in the upper mid-range. And then the mid-bass, I mentioned this is not a bassy set. I would actually say this is a little bit light on mid-bass. The bass that's here, it actually extends pretty well into the sub-bass frequencies, but I would describe this as very much neutral bass. It just extends really well so that you actually get that low rumble, but because there's not a lot of mid-bass body to it, you don't get maybe quite that same thump that you might get from a bassier set. And generally, I think it gives the Aiva a bit of a lean, airy sound. You could describe it as maybe a little bit thin, a little bit kind of open sounding, and I think you could definitely describe the Aiva as more analytical than musical, right? This is not like a warm, laid back envelop your head in thick, rich sound. This is very much a detail treble sort of focused sound. Not necessarily like super bright in the treble, but there is some treble emphasis here. So that is the sound signature of the Aiva. What do I like about the sound here? And I'll just say up front, generally the tonality I'm pretty happy with. You know, it's not exactly my preference. My tonal preference would be something like the Sennheiser HD600. This is a little bit on the thinner side, but I think this thing is tonally close enough. You know, the mid-range, there is some coloration there, but generally, you know, vocals and stuff like that, they come across naturally. They don't sound funky or anything like that. So generally pretty solid on the tonality. I would describe it the opposite of boxy. It's maybe a little bit light and lively. And the other thing that I like about the tuning here is the bass presentation, right? So you know me, I'm not a big bass guy. I do like a good quality bass. I just don't need a ton of it. And honestly, I think the Aiva delivers on that. The bass here extends really well. It's nice and tight, not super boomy. You're gonna get the tone of your bass guitars and kick drums and stuff like that, but it's not going to thump your head off. That said, what bass is here I think is actually really, really well done. But honestly, the bass is not the star here. The star here on the Aiva, and the reason that if you're considering the Aiva, the reason that you should be interested in the Aiva is the treble execution, which I've got some complaints about. Don't get me wrong, but the treble on the Aiva is actually pretty impressive. And it just really comes across in this really strong sense of speed. And I mentioned this is a planar driver, right? This is a planar magnetic driver rather than your typical dynamic driver. And one of the things that planars are known for is their speed and how fast they can react and kind of return to a default position. If you're in the IEM game, you're probably used to listening to balanced armatures. I think balanced armatures and planars, especially in the treble region, have a lot of similarities, where if you're used to that balanced armature character, you know, really fast, kind of sharp attack, that is what planars are basically known for. And the Aiva, I think, is a pretty strong example of that. The treble here is just really nice, tight, and snappy. Transients come across really, really solid on this thing. And gives kind of a little bit of emphasis to sort of that initial attack edge on certain notes, like drum strikes, cymbal strikes, and stuff like that. But even, honestly, a lot of other sounds that aren't necessarily high-frequency sounds, they will have this sort of leading transient edge on the sound that is in that high frequency. Again, like think of something like a guitar string pluck, right? The guitar note might not necessarily be a high frequency note, but that initial, that little, like that transient bit plays into the treble, and then that is a part where the Aiva really does something pretty neat. So yeah, that's one of the things I definitely like about it. It gives the Aiva, I think, a really strong sense of definition and separation and layering in the sound. I don't usually use the word soundstage a lot because I'm not certain that it means the same thing to everybody. Maybe none of these audio terms do. But I think that 3D sense, the sense of the instruments being, you know, bespoke sounds within this sort of sound field, the Aiva does a really, really strong job of that. You could also say that it's really pretty impressive at imaging. And the other thing that's worth talking about here in the Aiva, and it's probably related to that treble emphasis, but it's the detail perception. And this is a thing that's worth talking about a little bit specifically, okay? There are a number of headphones and earphones that I listen to that, you know, you just kind of get the sense that this is a nice, detailed, high-resolution earphone. But I think what that tends to mean to a lot of people is that you're hearing things that you can't hear in another headphone. And that's almost never the case. Like usually when I'm listening to, let's say, the Moondrop Blessing 2, a really detailed, high-resolution earphone for me, I can hear details that they stand out in a way that when I'm listening on another earphone, they don't stand out, or they just don't feel as well presented. But importantly, in that case, I'm not usually hearing things. I'm almost never hearing something that I actually can't hear in the other set, if that makes sense. The Aiva is probably the first time I've had the experience where I'm hearing a sound and I go to all of my other sets and I'm actually not hearing that sound. Now, there's a very particular case, and maybe it's just purely down to the frequency response emphasis, and maybe this particular sound happens to land in that. I'm not sure what's going on, but there's a song called Aquarelle by Men I Trust. I'll link to it in the description or something like that if it's interesting to anybody. But basically, it's just kind of like this cool, relaxed, really low-key sounding song. And in the background, when I was listening to it on the Aiva, I heard this it's almost like a clock ticking sound, and it's but like so quiet, like it almost sounded like a grandfather clock clicking in the background. My buddy Sean, he said that he thinks it's probably like the pieces inside of the piano, because this song does have a lot of piano in it. He thinks it's sort of the internals of the piano keys, or the arms. I don't know. I'm not a musician, but anyway, you hear these things just kind of lightly playing in the background, and I was like, oh, it's interesting. I've never noticed that before. And I've had that experience on headphones and earphones before where I notice a sound I didn't notice before. And usually it's because that set will emphasize some aspect of the frequency response that's different than the sets I'm used to. But if I go back to other sets, I'm like, oh yeah, I can hear it there. It's just not emphasized. With that sound here in the Aiva, I actually literally could not hear it on other headphones or earphones. Planet Jace, I see you asking if it's the metronome. It was a sound kind of like a metronome, and maybe it is a metronome. I don't know exactly what the sound is, but it's that kind of sound. And it was just really interesting to me that the Sendy Aiva was the only set that I own that I could actually pick that out on. So normally I'm a little bit allergic to saying that a headphone sounds especially detailed, but here with the Aiva, I think that's a description that it very much warrants. So that is what I like about the sound here on the Aiva. That was a little bit of gushing. Let's go ahead and talk about some things that maybe I don't love about the Aiva, and some things that you should definitely consider, because I don't think this headphone is necessarily for everybody. We talked about that treble emphasis, and there is some upper treble emphasis here, which can be irritating to certain people. I find the treble tuning on here generally pretty good, and pleasant for me, right? Because of the leading edge and the sharpness and the attack that it gives. I like that effect. But it can be a little bit fatiguing for some, and there's definitely some music that I'm listening to that it's not the best for. I don't greatly dislike this aspect of the Sendy Aiva, but I think it's worth calling out. It can also, that treble emphasis and where it's at and how it plays into just that transient attack on a lot of sounds, I think can make the Aiva sound a little bit mechanical and maybe a little bit less organic versus something like the Sennheiser HD600. And maybe that's just a typical trait of planar magnetics. I haven't heard enough to really know. But if we're talking about if we're talking about the different driver types and what they're known for, that might just be sort of a planar thing. And then the tonality, if we're getting picky about it, I think, again, that treble emphasis is definitely not purely neutral. There's more treble emphasis here, but where it's at, I find to be not in an overly irritating spot. Sibilance on this is not the best, but generally it's not an especially bad ear or headphone with sibilance. The treble is just a little bit too forward and maybe a little bit too tizzy if I'm being pedantic about this thing being, in line with my neutral reference. Again, the HD600. I think also the mid-range, I mentioned there's a little bit of coloration in the mid-range, and to be honest, I had a hard time kind of pinning it down. It seems like there's maybe some emphasis in, let's say, like the 1 to 2K region, but maybe it drops off a little bit after that, and so that gives it this sense of mid-range focus and forwardness, but also a bit of a hollowness in the top end. I don't know, I didn't find it overly bothersome, but again, if I'm being picky about describing this or comparing this against my optimal preferred frequency response, there's some coloration there in the mid-range that keeps this quite there. The other thing, and this is probably the biggest aspect, the biggest warning that I will give about the Sendy Aiva, is I think this headphone, just generally the sound signature, lacks a bit of body. I mentioned there's not a lot of mid-bass here, and generally I would describe the mid-range tuning, even though it's not like overly forward in the upper mid-range. In fact, it seems a little bit hollowed out in the upper mid-range, which might give you the impression that this is kind of a warmly tuned mid-range. The effect that I get in listening to this is actually not that warm. Like it feels thin. It feels a little bit lightweight, and again, it lacks some of that body, which, that's kind of, with headphones, there's trade-offs, right? And this is a particular sound going for a particular thing, and that sense of body, that sense of weight was a trade-off that was made here with the Aiva. So that's what I think about the sound of this headphone. Let me go ahead and move this stuff out of the way, however, and pull in some other headphones that I had around for comparison. So what we've got here is the Hifiman Sundara. Here we've got the Audeze LCD-2 Classic. And then, of course, I'm going to pull in my old favorite, the Sennheiser HD-600s. So these are the 4 headphones that for the past week I've been listening to and comparing to each other. And I figured, like I've been doing with the earphones, we'll go through a handful of different categories and attempt to rank these. Although I hope you'll forgive me. I don't have a lot of room on the table for moving them around, so I might just leave them in roughly this order. But let's talk about how these things compare in a handful of different categories. Okay, so let's just start with top level tonality. And I do have these things ranked at, and in terms of my tonal preferences, how I would rank these. The Sennheiser HD-600, this is my favorite. The Hifiman Sundara I would call second favorite. The Sendy Aiva is probably third, and then the LCD-2 Classic I would put last, just purely on tonality. So let's dive into the details, right? So the HD-600, my neutral benchmark, it actually has a bit of a full, warm, kind of thick sounding mid-range that I just really, really quite love. And then the treble tuning on this is honestly just about perfect for me. It's not overly forward or aggressive at all, but it's plenty present to just cut through that warmth and that thickness in the mid-range and give, a nice definition to sounds. Next up would be the Hifiman Sundara, which tonally is actually, I think, pretty similar to the HD-600. The upper mid-range, the vocal areas, I would say is a little bit wonkier here on the Sundara, where the trade-off is a little bit better extended bass versus the 600. So for some people, they actually might prefer the Sundara's tonality, but for my preferences, I would actually still pick the HD-600. Next up would be the Sendy Aiva, which pretty different tone, even though I would describe these all as like some form of neutral. This is just a lot thinner, airier. It's good for some, but might be a little bit too clinical for others. We already just talked about that sound, so I won't dive too much into that. And then finally, the Audeze LCD-2 Classic. This is, of the bunch here, by far the warmest. It's just kind of got this really laid back tune. Kind of a bit woolly, almost boxy in its tonality, in my opinion. And then the treble is fairly relaxed in here. The upper mid-range is very relaxed in here. So if you are allergic to an overly forward sound, you might actually prefer the Audeze. Just for my preferences, it's the last. The treble in here is not, it's not super rolled off or anything like that, but there's a little bit of a warm darkness to it, but with kind of an exception in a bit of the lower treble, it seems, where there's a little bit of a sharpness and just kind of like this jabbiness to the treble here. So that is how I would rank them in terms of tonality. How would I rank them in terms of technical performance? And again, you'll forgive me, I'm not going to move these things around, but I'm just going to go ahead and point to them. I'll say first place, second place for the 600s, and then these are roughly the same for me. Honestly, here on the Aiva, that detail advantage is, I think, a real advantage, and that's not a thing I will say about most headphones. This thing has just got a really nice sharp attack on the transients. It's nice and clean. The bass that's here is a little bit on the light side, but it's good bass. It extends well, fairly linear. Yeah, generally the technical performance on this thing is just pretty solid and really, really strong on imaging. Next up, I would say the HD-600, which is not especially strong in the imaging or soundstage. Like, that's kind of what it's known for, and that's fine. But what this does really well, I think, is just really organic timbre. Everything just sounds quite right on here. And the treble that's here, even though it's not an especially brightly tuned headphone or anything like that, The HD600 is just really good at conveying that texture, both in the mid-range and in the treble, that I really like in my sound. When it comes to the bass, I would say that this is probably the weakest bass of the four here, and so if you are a person who prioritizes the quality of your bass, you might be disappointed here with the HD600. It's just a bit soft and kind of lacks impact, but it's not a problem for me. Next up, and then yeah, I guess I'll say that the Sundara and the LCD-2 Classic, for me, they seem about on par in terms of their technical performance, which is, they're okay, like, which is interesting because this is, the planar magnetic, and I talked about it being really fast and snappy and that kind of being what planars are known for. These also being planars, I feel like they don't have that character at all. These have a bit of that kind of like plasticky BA timbre in the mid-range, which is the thing that kind of unifies these two units. But in terms of the treble performance, I don't know. I don't really hear that BA-ness there. The bass between these two, I think, is both pretty similar. Not necessarily the most extended bass. I think the Aiva is a little bit tighter in the bass presentation, but you get more mid-bass impact, especially here with the LCD-2 Classic. Yeah, and the treble performance in both of these just honestly is probably the biggest detractor for me. Here on the Sundara, it's a little bit too smoothed over, and then here it's just a little bit, just the tonality in generally is a bit funky. All right, so what do we want to talk about next? I wanted to talk about comfort and fit, which I think is actually pretty important with headphones especially. Well, I guess it's really important with earphones too. But these are all pretty different in different ways, and how I would rank these in terms of comfort, I think the Sendy Aiva is actually the most comfortable. Out of the box, this thing's just comfortable, no issues with it. Like, it's got a nice clamp, it's got plenty of flexibility. You've got these, fairly deep pads. Generally, honestly, this is just one of the more comfortable headphones I've worn. It's not especially, like, it doesn't look like it should necessarily be the most comfortable headphone, but honestly, in practice, I found that this was pretty phenomenal. Next up, I would say, is the Sennheiser HD600, which, yes, I know this thing has a reputation for being a very clampy headphone, a very tight clamp. But for me, I've had this headphone for a couple of years, so it's been worn in. Once you get past that tight clamp, and you can get past it pretty quickly just by stretching out the band, I honestly find the HD600 just really, really comfortable. Like, it fits my head, kind of like a nice shoe, where it's tight, it's comfortable, it's snug, but it's not, it's not bunching you up. This is just a really good set. And the other thing worth calling out about this, and I'll talk about the weight in a second, is this is by far the lightest of these headphones. Next up in terms of comfort, I would say the Sundara is probably next. Like, this is not an uncomfortable headphone, but it's also not especially plush. There's not a lot of range and motion in the ear cups. For me, the biggest issue that I have with the Sundara, and I'm not going to be able to well, there we go. I can kind of show it like this. The ear cups are, relatively large and round circles, but my ear is not this shape. And I have issues. My ears kind of interact with the ear pads on the top and the bottom. Not a big deal, if I'm perfectly honest, but we're talking about ranking these things in terms of comfort. I would say that would be after these two. And then finally would be the Audeze LCD-2 Classic, just in terms of comfort and fit. I think the design on this, I actually really love the look of it. It kind of looks a bit science experimenty. But it feels a little bit janky. You can kind of see, there's plenty of motion in this, which I guess is nice. But it is, honestly, the biggest issue with this thing is the weight. This is heavy. So I wanted to talk about the weight because I did measure these things. The Sennheiser HD600 being the lightest of the three here, or the four, 258 grams. So again, comparison, what did the AirPods, I said it was 380 grams. This is about 100 grams lighter than the AirPods Max. Now, the Sendy Aiva, no, actually the Hifiman Sundara would be the next lightest one. It's about 50% heavier though, at 394 grams. I honestly don't have an issue with the weight of this, but worth calling out. The Aiva would be the next heaviest at 418 grams is what I measured. That puts it at 62% heavier than the HD600. And then finally, the Audeze LCD-2. This is the one where, in my opinion, this is where weight becomes a problem. And this is going to be different for everybody, right? People are just different sizes and weight matters more to different people, but this is where it becomes a problem for me. 546 grams. This weighs literally 112% more than the HD600s, which means it weighs twice as much. You could wear two HD600s and it would still weigh less than the Audeze LCD-2. Okay, that is a lot to have talked about. So I think I'm ready to go ahead and finalize this review and give it a score. I think out of 5 stars, the Sendy Aiva, honestly a headphone I quite like. I'm gonna give it a very solid 4 stars. Honestly, if it wasn't for the aesthetic and maybe the price at $600, it's a bit much, but you do get some pretty nice characteristics that I don't see in these other headphones. So maybe there's a pretty good argument for it. But as it is, I think this is actually a pretty solid headphone. I wish it had maybe a little bit more coherent of a design. Ultimately, I would still probably buy the HD600 for myself if I was looking for just one headphone. But if you're looking for a second headphone, the Sendy Aiva, not a bad option. If you're interested in checking out this headphone, of course, I do have a link in the description down below. And shout out to Sendy Aiva, Sendy, for sending this in for review. While you're down there, if you like this video, if you found this helpful, please do hit the like button. It helps me out. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and ding the YouTube bell. And then I'll catch you on the next super review so we can have a chat like I'm about to have with the folks who are here live right now. Hang on, folks. Let me catch up. All right, let me move some stuff around this table and grab a drink of water. All right, let me catch up with live chat as best as possible. Thank you all for hanging out, being patient with me. The initial shout outs, Precog Vision, what's up? Welcome. Glad you can make it. Rob Hawk, how you doing, man? Planet Jace, wow, in Australia again, I assume. Happy Saturday morning, yeah. It's Friday evening here. Ishan, hey, how's it going? Edward Bedore, gasp, a headphone I know. I hope that's okay. This is not the first headphone I've reviewed on the channel. Let's see, in fact, I started the channel reviewing headphones, so I don't know. I reviewed more headphones in the past than I have recently, but certainly the IEM game, there's just new stuff coming out all the time. Whereas in the headphone game, it doesn't seem like that's necessarily the case. Mervyn Dela Cruz, hey, how's it going? Good morning. I guess, are you in Australia too? Susie Bon, yo, how's it going? Alan Shaw saying, I auditioned those a while back. The dealer told me they sold 25 pairs in a week and people did love them. Interesting. Alan, what did you think about Sendy Aiva? Yeah, it's honestly a pretty impressive set. I did not know what to expect of this. I knew that I had seen reviews of it in the past, and it seemed like there was a bit of hype around them, but then I also knew that there was that kind of controversy, which I am not embroiled in. I just was aware of it in the background of the audiophile community stuff, and so I was pretty interested to hear it, and I guess happy to find out that I like the way this thing sounds. Definitely not for everybody, though, because it is thin and analytical. But in a way that I don't find overly abrasive or boring. It's actually a really interesting headphone to listen to. Audiofool saying yes, headphones. Okay, so maybe I should do more headphone reviews. We'll see. And yeah, Planet Jace, like you're saying, it's a victim of the hype cycle of internet reviewers. I'm sure I've contributed inadvertently myself in some ways, but I guess if I'm a couple of years late to this one, maybe not so much. Rob Hawk asking, do you ever test different IMs by mixing them on the same cable, by comparing brand A right ear with brand AB left ear? No, I've considered that as a possibility, but it's not going to work for a couple of reasons. One, like just try listening to any earphone with just one earpiece. It's gonna sound wrong. It's not gonna sound good. Maybe if you had 2 different pieces in your ears, maybe it would fill out the sound enough that you would be able to get past the fact that it doesn't sound right and just be able to compare tonalities and stuff like that. But I don't know. My experience with just wearing one earbud, it suggests to me that that's just not going to be a very good comparison.
Tyler Durden saying the Sivga P2s are my favorite headphones I've bought to date. And so the Sivga P2, I believe, is one of the other headphones that uses this same driver in it. I think that Sendy's been getting like so much flack about this being the same driver in other headphones like the Sivga that on Music Tech's website, and I think Music Tech is kind of their main distributor, I have them linked in the description, on that website listing for the Aiva, there's actually like a 20-page PDF document talking about the differences between the Aiva and the Sivga P2 or whatever it's called. Most of them are physical though, which is interesting because they do even show frequency responses between this and the Sivga, and they line up pretty close. Like they look identical enough that I would say they probably sound the same. But they definitely go to great lengths to talk about how the build is different than the Sivga, the Skivga. Oh, Planet J saying the speaker that I mentioned last review. Yep, that is. These are new. These are new in my life as speakers. This is a pair of Presonus Eris E5s. Look, I don't know much about speakers and monitors in general. This is my first set, but pretty happy with them. But they are pretty close to me right here, and obviously intruding on my space. Alan, so you're saying that to you, the Sendy Aiva sounds like the Sennheiser HD660S, but with actually decent imaging. Okay, interesting. I have heard the HD660S, which from memory was kind of like, for me, in between the HD650 and the HD600 in terms of tonality, so maybe not quite as warm and laid back as the HD650, but also not as forward as the 600, but I didn't have it here for comparison to the Aiva. Big Boss, how you doing? Good to see you here. Alan's saying, YouTubers love to use aftermarket cables while telling viewers that cables don't matter. So I feel a little called out here. That's fine. I'm definitely of the opinion that cables, in all but the most extreme of cases, do not affect the sound of your headphones, your earphones. There are definitely some exceptions if you want to get really technical, but for the most part, people shopping different cables, sound should be, in my opinion, the last thing on your mind. For me, I like swapping cables on my sets just because you get something that feels nicer or looks nicer. Maybe it's more comfortable. Maybe it roadie wraps better. Those are reasons for me why I swap cables on my sets. And it's not because I want to change the sound. Marius Phillips saying, regarding IMs, have you tried those two models from Meze, the Rai Solo and the Rai Penta? The Rai Solo is more budget friendly. I have not heard those, no. I think, here's what I'll say about the Mezes. They are really, really attractive IMs. Meze really does a good job with the physical form of all of their stuff. Their headphones, their IMs just look beautiful, and I think the Rai Solo, not too expensive, but it looks like a really nicely built earphone. That said, I have not heard the best things about the sound of them. Again, I haven't heard it myself, so take that with a grain of salt, but because I haven't heard the best things about them, I haven't gone out of my way to hear them. Alan SH saying AirPods Max sound like trash. I think I disagree, actually. I think the AirPods Max are not a bad sounding headphone. Not my favorite tuning. They're pretty muted in the upper mid-range. I like my vocals. But they're very much about the bass and the upper treble, and in a way that's not too dissimilar from here. Although I don't think the AirPods Max do it as well, but also we're talking about a closed back Bluetooth headphone. So within the context of closed back Bluetooth noise canceling headphones, I think the AirPods Max actually sounds pretty good. Big Boss saying, speaking before Mark describes the sound, if the HD800S comparison doesn't happen, then his review needs a do-over with them. Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't actually heard the HD800S. I have heard the HD800, but that was probably like 2, maybe almost 3 years ago. Not going to be a comparison that I can make, unfortunately. Maybe one day, though. Kyle Dykes saying most people will spend a little money on well-built cables, but they dog the crazy expensive with the silly promises that people try to sell if you've never caught on. Yeah, I agree with that. That's some cables, like, you know, you can get a replacement cable for a lot of headphones and a lot of IMs for 50, 30 bucks. You can also spend, 60, 100, maybe even 150 bucks for a really nice cable. And in my opinion, that's hard for me to justify. But if I really loved a set and I really wanted a nice cable on it, that to me seems reasonable. The cables that cost like thousands of dollars, I don't understand that at all. And I think Kyle, I think we're on the same page there. Oh, and Alan, you said that you auditioned the Sendy Aiva on the Estelle & Kern SP2000 DAP and it had no issue driving those, which actually I think is worth calling out. I didn't really talk about how difficult or not difficult these sets are to drive. Of these, I would say that the Sennheiser and the Sundara were probably the two harder to drive. It just, when I was going A-Bing these things, I would have to turn up the volume a little bit to listen to at the same volume level for these two, where these two were a little bit more sensitive. Now, that said too, I ran all of these perfectly fine off of my MacBook, not with an amplifier or anything like that, and yeah, I mean, that wasn't my primary listening device. I was primarily listening on, I don't have it around here, but my Hibi R5S digital audio player. But yeah, honestly, to that point, I just didn't have any issue powering these off of even a MacBook. Oh, DNT Arc asking for a pebble check. DNT Arc, there's your pebble check. Alan Shook, man, you've got some interesting hot takes. I don't think I agree with you very often. Saying HD600 is so worthless in 2021. Okay. I mean, look, we all have our own opinions and preferences, and there's a lot of things that the HD600 doesn't necessarily do that great. If you're looking for a really big sound staging headphone with phenomenal bass, like, that's not this set. But for what I like, vocal texture and quality, still have not honestly found anything I like better than the HD600. I would cool it with the worthless language. I don't know about that. Oh, Sueno Tremendo, what's up? Hola, how you doing, man? So you're saying Aiva detail and you put a crown on it. I'm guessing that means you've heard the Aiva and maybe you've got a similar opinion about it. I'll check your channel and see if you've got a review of that one. I'd be interested in checking that out with the translation on. Planet J saying worth, value is still a personal thing. Enjoyment also disregards quality, cost, and perception of worth. They're worth something to Mark, therefore not worthless. Okay, you're defending the HD600. Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, not a word I would use to describe a lot of things. Worthless. Still catching up with live chat. Chef Steve saying when you buy the Audeze, they should include a neck brace. It's an interesting thing. So I didn't actually do the fit test with these headphones. I'll throw it on my dome so you can take a look at it. It's obviously a fairly large fitting headphone. The suspension strap, I, again, generally a pretty big fan of this fit style. So, and then the ear cups are really quite spacious. So initially, this feels like a pretty comfortable headphone, but it's once you start wearing this thing for like 30 minutes to an hour where you start really realizing that you've got 500 grams. You've got, is that half a kilo? I'm not metric, but you've got a lot of weight on your head. And it really does add up. So for folks who've maybe never worn them or you've only maybe demoed them in a store, try it for like 30 minutes. And I know that's a long time to demo, but try it for 30 minutes to an hour. Let me know how you think, or how you feel. I am the law asking, what's with the new Nothing Ear 1 hype? And I would also like to know what's up with the new Nothing 1 ear hype. I'm sure everybody here, you're on YouTube, you probably are aware. There's this new earphone called the Nothing. Looks like an AirPods Max kind of budget alternative, and somehow they were able to generate a lot of hype. I think a lot of manufacturers would love to be able to generate that level of hype for what looks like, I don't know, it's like a true wireless earphone with noise canceling for $100. Like, get in line. There's a bunch of those. Maybe it's better than all the other ones out there. I don't know, maybe, but good job at generating the hype. Planet J saying I use different cables for aesthetic or functional reasons, nothing to do with them doing anything different. I assume you're talking about with sound. And yep, I agree. Oh. Vane Exler? Probably not pronouncing that correctly, but I think you made a good point. You said pads matter more if you want to change the sound signature versus the cable, and that's completely the case. So all of these sets, right, they come with stock sets of pads, and manufacturers will offer aftermarket pads for them. Word of warning to anyone who's interested in replacing the pads on their headphones, it's going to change the sound of your headphone, probably by quite a bit, honestly. In some ways, it can actually improve the sound. Like I had reviewed the Meze 99 Classics, and I didn't love the way that headphone sounded. Someone in the YouTube comments actually recommended me swapping pads, and so that sent me down this rabbit hole of trying a bunch of different pad swaps on that set. Some of them made it worse. Some of them actually made it sound better though, and so that's a possibility. But I would just say, word of warning to anyone who's looking to swap pads on any of these headphones, they will change the sound. Do your research and make sure that it's going to be a change that you want. Oh, Alan, the Sennheisers are trash, guys. You got to use Cardus Clear Beyond Power Cable, and it's a huge upgrade over the Audio Quest Thunder. What difference do you get from a power cable? In Planet JS, yes, I did have the audacity to run these things off of a MacBook Air even. It is an M1 MacBook Air, which those can do no wrong, as we know. But yeah, it's a bit of an audiophile sin, I admit. Audiophile asking, what is a Pebble check? Pebble is this watch. This watch that I wear is a Pebble. This is a smartwatch from like 2016. Still the best smartwatch on the market. That's right. But DNTR homie also got one just recently. So he wanted to see mine, I guess. Joseph asking opinions on DAP versus a DAC amp on a phone. Yeah, I think that's a tricky one. I think if you're just looking at it from the sound quality perspective, which is how this question comes to me most often, people think that and I don't want to say they're wrong, but people kind of have the assumption that you go with a digital audio player because you want really nice sound quality. In my experience, a good DAC amp, even something like an Apple dongle, is going to sound as good as any digital audio player that I've personally listened to. So I wouldn't make that decision based on sound quality. If you're just after sound quality, a DAC amp on your phone is going to be the cheapest, most reasonable way to get there. For me, though, I end up using digital audio players more than I use my phone for listening to music, like way more. I love DAPs, but it's not because they sound phenomenal. They sound good, but it's because the buttons. Let me reach over here. All right, so here on the table, typical smartphones, a Sony Xperia 10. This is what I use for listening to music if I'm going to use a smartphone for that stuff. And then here is my Sony NWA-105 Walkman. Why I love this thing? Right there, buttons. Having buttons to be able to just put this in my pocket, reach in, click pause, play, skip tracks. Can't really do that with a mobile phone. Even if you get a DAC amp, an external DAC amp, and maybe there are some of them that have buttons integrated. I wish there were more of them. But for that reason alone, that is why I personally choose to use DAPs. If you're just looking for good sound quality, a DAC amp for your phone is going to give you that cheaper. Again, an Apple dongle, $9 will get you there. If you need more power, you can get more power out of some DAPs, but they get pretty expensive. So even there, I think that a DAC amp for your phone is going to be a cheaper, more affordable route to more power. But they're not going to give you buttons. And if you want buttons, you got to go the DAP route. Alan, if you're not already in the Discord server, I recommend joining and checking out the Source Memes channel. We got a pill for you. Planet Jace, you think the LCDs look silly? Let me go ahead and just do the full on fit demonstration of all these headphones. So the LCD-2 Classic, you know, it's definitely, this is a thing. This is not, you don't walk in a room with someone wearing an LCD-2 Classic and not notice it. They're not just wearing a pair of Beats or something like that. This is definitely a thing. I think it's cool looking, but maybe I don't look cool. I'm not too worried about that personally. But here's what the Hifiman Sundara looks like on my head. I think it's similar, but maybe a little bit more compact, a little bit tidier, a little bit less, actually quite a bit tidier. Definitely here from the the front on perspective. Then we go with my beloved HD 600s, which I always thought that these kind of give the impression of like Leia from Star Wars. Sorry, that was actually not on purpose. But Leia from Star Wars, she's got like that hairstyle with the buns around her ears. That's what to me the Sennheisers look like. And then we'll go back to Sendy Aiva. I've got that on. No, that was correct. Hair's just in the way. There you go. Sendy Aiva. Fairly compact, but the wood cups stand out a little bit. So I don't know which one looks the coolest. I think to look at here on a table, I think the LCD-2 Classic looks the coolest. Next up, I would say the Sennheisers with just the awful marble pattern that I love. Third, I would say that the Sundara looks pretty bare bones and minimum, but I like the aesthetic. And then here, the Aiva, it's a little busy for me and a little bit, again, mishmash. Oh, Rob Hawk, your tip for living with the heavy Audeze headphones. You say you have the LCD2 or the LCD XC. And it helps to have a good recliner. That makes sense. Give the old neck a rest. Chef Steve saying you should try the Audio-Technica R70X. It does very little wrong, better than the HD600 in your opinion. That is a headphone I'm very interested to try because I've heard that compared to the HD600. And being a big fan of the HD600, anything that gets compared to it, I'm interested in hearing. But I haven't yet. Big Boss, I see you saying that you'd be interested in me reviewing that headphone, so maybe I'll make an effort to listen to it. Vitor Roma saying power cable improvements are BS. It's not like the power lines in the streets and wiring inside your walls are audiophile grade. Yeah, the I don't really know what to make of people's interest in power cables for improving sound quality. What I can say is, you know, I mentioned I recently set up these speakers. This was one of the only times where I've set up a piece of audio equipment in an area, and this is the area, my desk, where these run into some issues. Like right out of the box when I set them up, really pretty enormous ground loop sound that was playing, and it was super audible, like not even like super audible. It was irritating. Like I couldn't have the speakers turned on. It was that loud. Maybe if I was running these things balanced, that would solve that problem. I don't know. Maybe if I had a power cable that was this thick and can avoid interference, maybe that would solve the problem. I don't know. I think it's probably a little bit more complicated than that, and it's down to just there being a lot of things here plugged in. But it was interesting that I heard that difference here on the speakers, but I've never heard that on the rest of my sound stuff that is hooked up to the exact same power cables, right? So it's like there's some shielding, some filtering or whatever that's not happening inside here that ostensibly is happening in my shit amplifiers and stuff like that. So I'm not sure what's up, but maybe having a power cable this thick would help. Maybe not. And I think also if you don't have that problem, I have no idea what a power cable is going to do for you. Sniper asking, does DAC change sound signature produced from the headphone? My experience is that sometimes I think I can hear a little bit of difference between different DACs, but it's pretty minor and it really only stands out when I'm A/B testing them, like comparing them head to head. And even then, I'm not like super confident that I would hear that difference if I didn't know what I was listening to. So in my opinion, yeah, a DAC can kind of make a difference, but it's not a difference that I'm really that interested in. Still catching up with live chat here. Appreciate the spirited talk about cables and whether or not they make a difference. Big Boss saying, wow, didn't think about the Leia comparison until now on the HD600 front-facing aesthetic, right? Like, seriously. How am I not Leia for Halloween? Now I feel like I gotta do that. Vainsler saying you need to compare the HD600 and the Alex too. So I have heard the Alex, the Focal Alex, a little bit, but definitely not long enough to review it. I can see why it gets compared to the HD600, like it's in the ballpark tonally wise, but definitely sounds quite a bit different. The bass, I think, on the ELX was a lot better defined, but the treble timbre I found a little bit on the metallic side. That said, I have thought about, every once in a while when the ELX goes on sale and drop, I'm just like, maybe. But then I kind of come to the conclusion that I probably wouldn't spend that much time listening to it. Sniper saying, God damn, I regret this name. Pick this name when you were 12. Yeah, it's the struggles of the internet, right? You pick. I actually have an email address, which I'm not gonna reveal here, but I have an email address that I've had since I believe 2000, the year 2000. It's like over a 20-year-old email address. Still works. Still get email on it. And then user with a name that I'm not going to be able to pronounce saying speakers tend to be an ass that way and no power cables don't make any difference, but balanced will make a difference. Talking about the ground loop that I was experiencing here with the speakers. The solution, I don't know if this is an advice solution, but the solution that I found online, and it totally worked for me, was just taking the three-prong cable, the three-prong power cable that comes out of this powered speaker, and plugging it into an adapter that turns it into a two-prong cable. So I basically just removed the ground, which solved the ground loop, because there's no ground anymore. Maybe I'm going to avoid my warranty, but it doesn't make an excruciatingly bad sound anymore. And Joseph, I see you saying you have the Zeros 4.5 with the noise floor, but they're active. So yeah, just FYI, the Aris E5s that I have here are also an active speaker. There's a bit of a noise floor amp hiss. Like if I put my ear close to it, I can hear it. But if I'm sitting back in my normal sitting position, I don't hear it, which is nice. But that's very different from the ground loop noise that I heard, which is excruciating. I actually put a video of it on Discord if anyone's interested in it. Planet Jace, I feel like I'm missing some context. Oh, the gold bikini because of the Leia. Yeah. If I do the gold bikini plus this, will people get it? I'm not a big enough Star Wars fan to know. Maybe that's sacrilege. But I'm not above that. All right, folks, it's getting pretty warm in here. I've got the windows closed because we don't want to hear the dogs barking outside or the chickens crowing, but it's actually pretty warm. So I'm going to call it an end to the stream. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for the chat, hanging out. If you want to chat more, check out the link to the Discord server in the description down below. I'm there way too much. I'll show you the video of my speakers humming. I don't know. We'll show you a picture of me in a bikini, dressed up like Princess Leia. Probably not, actually, though. But yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Ding the bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Have a good one.